The air felt colder near the counter, like the bank kept its own kind of winter. Elijah Turner stood in it, quiet as a shadow, his denim jacket carrying the scent of the fields he'd worked since boyhood. His hands were rough, cracked in places where the earth had claimed him over the years. In those hands rested a single check, thin paper, lightweight. But it carried the whole season on its back, the drought that baked the land until the soil curled, the debts stacking like storm clouds, the tractor that coughed its last breath one morning before sunrise. That check wasn't money, it was survival. He stepped forward when the line opened, simple movement, but the room shifted as though someone had dimmed the lights. Maybe it was the way the polished tiles reflected the glare overhead, or maybe it was the way people stopped pretending not to look at him. Melissa was waiting behind the counter. Her hair was neat, her blouse crisp, her smile tight enough to cut paper. She scanned him first, slow, like she was reading the outside before bothering with the inside. Then she looked at the check. Her smile shrank into a thin line holding back something sharper. "Sir," she said, her tone sweetened but not warm, "we'll need more verification. This amount doesn't look right." Her voice carried, too loud, louder than the white man before Elijah, louder than the woman 3 spots back, loud enough that heads began lifting like prairie dogs sensing trouble. Elijah stood still, breathing in the cold, breathing out the heat building under his ribs. He nodded once, trying to keep the moment soft. "Ma'am, this is from..." She cut him off with a raised hand. "I'm sorry, but we can't just cash anything like this, not without further proof." The words dropped like stones. He tried again. "I've been doing business with this bank for..." "Yes, sir, but policies are policies." She leaned forward, lowering her voice only to fill it with something smug. "We don't see checks like this from everyone." Elijah heard it, not the words, but what lived under them. A man in line whispered something to his wife. Someone coughed awkwardly. Another person stepped farther away, as if suspicion was contagious. Elijah felt the old sting memories of teachers who didn't believe his test scores were his, store owners who watched him more than the merchandise, officials who treated his farm like a joke until they saw the yield numbers. A lifetime of being sized up before being spoken to. He steadied himself and placed his calloused hands on the counter gently, as if holding a frightened animal. "Ma'am, I can explain." Melissa didn't care for explanations. She waved at another employee. "Could we get a supervisor? We have a questionable check here." Questionable, the word echoed off the marble walls. The supervisor arrived, a man who looked tired and inconvenienced. Melissa handed him the check like evidence from a crime scene. They whispered, they frowned. They both looked at Elijah with the same unreadable expression, one he'd learned long ago, the look that measured your worth before acknowledging your words. "We'll need time to verify this," the supervisor said finally. "You'll have to step aside." Step aside, always the same direction. Elijah swallowed the anger clawing up his throat. Not rage, no, it wasn't that. It was weariness, the kind that settled deep, older than the lines in his face. He stepped back, giving them space, even though the check was his. People watched openly now, some pretending not to, some not bothering. A woman clutched her purse closer. A teenager smirked. An older man shook his head like he'd seen this play out before. Elijah felt his dignity folding in on itself, slow and deliberate, felt the humiliation warming his neck, felt every year of being underestimated pressing against his chest. He straightened his shoulders anyway. After a minute, or maybe 5, the supervisor came back and slid the check across the counter as if it were contaminated. "We can't cash this today. There are inconsistencies." Inconsistencies, another stone. The check trembled only because Elijah's hand trembled. Melissa folded her arms, satisfied. The supervisor walked off before Elijah could speak. He stood there a moment longer, letting silence fill him the way breath once had. Then he picked up the check, tucking it carefully into his pocket like it might bruise. He turned and walked toward the exit, each step echoing in the vast quiet of the lobby. People parted just enough to let him pass. He didn't look at them, didn't need to. He knew the looks by feel, heavy, curious, judgment wrapped in politeness. Outside, the sun hit him like a truth, bright, unfiltered, honest. He paused on the steps, letting the warm air thaw the cold still stuck to his skin. For a moment he closed his eyes. He saw the fields back home, the crops bending under the wind, the cracked boots by his door, the harvest that nearly didn't come, the nights he'd stayed up wondering if he'd lose the land his father once walked. He felt everything he wasn't allowed to feel inside the bank. When he opened his eyes, his jaw tightened with something new. Not anger, not fear, something steadier, something rising. He whispered to himself, voice low, almost lost to the passing cars. Some folks see dirt where others see roots. The words steadied him. They reminded him who he was, a man who grew life from the ground, who survived seasons that broke stronger men, who knew the worth of things that didn't glitter. The check in his pocket was proof of his labor. It was enough, even if they couldn't see it. He walked down the steps with slow, measured steps, the kind a man takes when something inside him begins to turn. A shift, quiet but powerful, moving like the first crack of dawn across a dark field. He didn't know what the bank would learn, not yet. Life had its own way of revealing truths, sometimes sudden, sometimes loud. But he knew this much. The next time he walked into a place built to make him feel small, he'd carry with him not just his check, not just his history, but the weight of a man who understood roots, who knew what grew from being underestimated, who knew what strength could rise from the soil of humiliation. The shift inside him wasn't anger. It was awakening, and it had only just begun. The truck groaned as it rolled down the dusty road, the engine shaking like it was tired from carrying too many years. Elijah Turner kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting lightly on the window frame, letting the cold air bite at his knuckles. Acres stretched on both sides of him, empty, winter-stripped, quiet. But to him, they weren't empty at all. They were full of ghosts, full of the footsteps of men who came before him, his father, his grandfather. Their calloused hands gripping fence posts, their sweat sinking into the soil like unspoken prayers. He wasn't just driving home, he was driving through memory. Every field whispered something, and he heard it, even under the rumble of the engine. It reminded him who he was, even when the world tried to forget. But the bank's rejection clung to him like dust he couldn't brush off. He replayed the moment in the lobby, hearing the clipped tone of the teller, the supervisor's dismissive glance. Those words echoed louder out here, where nothing interrupted them. He'd endured insults before, walked through the quiet storms of judgment more times than he cared to count, but today's cut a little deeper. Maybe because he'd fought so hard this season, maybe because he was tired of bending when the world pushed. Sometimes, he thought, the soil respected him more than people ever tried to. The truck turned up the long gravel path toward the house, a modest place with peeling paint and a porch built by hands that didn't believe in taking shortcuts. The porch light flickered like it was waving him home, and standing in front of it, wrapped in a knitted sweater and worry, was Naomi. His daughter had her mother's eyes, soft enough to comfort, sharp enough to see through anything. She watched the truck crawl to a stop, watched him sit for a moment before opening the door, gathering the weight off his shoulders. She already knew. "Daddy," she said, stepping forward, voice low, "they turned you away again." Elijah didn't trust his voice yet, so he simply nodded. Naomi's jaw tightened, anger rising like heat from a flame. "Daddy, that check was earned. Every line on it came from your back and your hands. You don't owe those people apologies for existing." He almost smiled, almost, but the hurt sat too heavy. Elijah had lived his life choosing peace over reaction. He believed in letting storms pass instead of feeding them. He knew the difference between silence and surrender. Wisdom had grown in him the same way crops did, planted deep, fought through harsh seasons, and finally reached the light. Sometimes that wisdom felt like armor, sometimes it felt like weight. He walked past her gently, brushing her arm with a tired touch. Inside, the house smelled of old wood and the last cup of coffee left warming on the stove. Naomi followed him, leaning against the doorway as he hung his jacket on the same hook he'd used for 20 years. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the check, and laid it on the table carefully, like it might bruise again. Naomi stared at it, her frustration crackling in the air. "You shouldn't have to fight this hard," she murmured. Elijah didn't answer. He didn't know how to. On the counter sat a stack of unpaid bills, corners curled from handling. Beneath them, half hidden like it was trying not to be noticed, poked out the edge of an old lottery ticket. A whim, a joke, he'd called it, something Naomi convinced him to buy on the last supply run to town. "Just for fun," she'd said with a smile. "You never know, Daddy." He laughed at it then, a soft, breathy laugh, as if the idea of luck ever landing in his lap was too wild to imagine. Tonight, while searching for the check, Naomi saw the ticket. Its corner stuck out like a shy reminder. She pulled it out, smoothing it between her fingers. It felt flimsy, useless, but something, maybe instinct, maybe hope, pressed gently at the back of her mind. "Daddy," she said, picking up the remote, "what were the numbers again?" Elijah raised a brow. "You don't need to bother with that thing." "It won't hurt," she insisted, walking toward the old TV in the corner. The TV was a stubborn relic, fuzzy screen, static hum, antenna leaning like it lost a fight long ago. Naomi tapped the side once, twice. The screen flickered to life, colors warping before settling into a shaky picture. The lottery broadcast was still on, the host smiling too brightly for that late hour. Naomi held the ticket in one hand, pointing with the other at the numbers on the screen. "All right," she muttered, "let's see." Elijah sat slowly, watching her with the kind of soft affection he rarely showed in words. To him, it was just a ticket. The world didn't hand out miracles, certainly not to men who spent their whole lives wrestling the earth for every inch. But Naomi's face changed. Her eyebrows lifted, then froze, her lips parted just slightly, breath catching like she'd stepped into cold water. She looked down at the ticket, looked back at the screen, then checked again. Her fingers trembled just a little, like she wasn't sure she trusted her own sight. "Daddy," her voice cracked on the second syllable. "Come here." Elijah frowned. "What is it?" "Come here," she repeated, firmer this time, urgent. He rose slowly, skepticism tugging at his steps. Naomi handed him the ticket, her eyes glossy with something she wasn't ready to believe. "Read them," she whispered. "Read them out loud." Elijah held the ticket close, squinting slightly as he read the first number. His gaze shifted to the screen. They matched. He read the second, match. The third, another match. By the fourth, his breath shortened. By the fifth, his hand began to shake. The final number felt like it echoed through the whole house when he whispered it. Naomi covered her mouth, tears gathering at her lashes. "Daddy," she breathed, stepping closer, you won." Elijah didn't move at first. His mind refused to stretch that far. It was too big, too unreal. He stood there in the dim light of a worn-out living room, holding a piece of paper worth more than he'd made in his entire life combined. The kind of money that could save the farm, fix every broken thing, change the shape of their future. But the world didn't know yet. The bank didn't know. Melissa didn't know. The same people who doubted his check, doubted his worth, doubted his right to stand there with dignity. They had no idea the man they turned away held a miracle in his pocket the whole time. Naomi took his hand, squeezing it tight. "Daddy, this changes everything." Elijah finally exhaled, a long, slow release he didn't realize he'd been holding. His legs felt unsteady, like the ground wasn't sure whether to shift or stay still. But the moment didn't explode. It didn't rush towards celebration or shock. It settled quietly between them, heavy, sacred, real in a way that made the room feel smaller, like the world outside had disappeared for a moment. He looked down at the ticket again, the ink blurring as his eyes strung. And he whispered, almost to himself, "Lord, help me carry this right." Naomi leaned into him, her voice soft. "We will, together." Outside, the winter wind brushed against the windows. The fields lay waiting, silent, patient, as if they sensed something rising in the Turner house, a truth that would shift every line of the story. The world wasn't ready. Not yet. But morning was coming. The living room was dim, lit only by the weak glow of the old lamp in the corner and the flickering TV screen fighting through its own static. Elijah Turner walked in slow, wiping his hands on his jeans like he always did after coming in from the cold. He didn't expect anything unusual, just another evening settling over a tired day, another night trying to push aside the weight the world handed him. He didn't know fate was sitting on the coffee table, a flimsy scrap of paper that meant nothing yesterday and held everything tonight. Naomi stood near the TV, shoulders stiff, breath uneven. She held the lottery ticket like it was alive, like it might jump out of her fingers. Her eyes were wide in a way he didn't see often, not fear, not hope, something in between. "Daddy, look," she whispered. He frowned, stepping closer. Her voice wasn't steady, and Naomi Turner didn't shake easily. He followed her gaze to the screen. Bright white numbers glowed across the bottom, steady and unbothered by the storm they were about to cause. The announcer's voice droned on, cheerful and distant, but Naomi didn't hear a word. She read the numbers one by one. "Elijah," she said softly, "the first one, it's the same." He stared at her, confused. Same as what? She handed him the ticket, her fingers brushing his like she was passing something holy. Elijah held it up, squinting. Naomi looked back at the screen. The second number flashed across. "That's a match too." He blinked at the ticket again, then at the TV. His heart gave a small, startled jump, like it didn't know whether to run or stay still. The third number rolled across the bottom of the screen. Naomi's breath hitched. Elijah's lips parted, but no sound came out. The fourth matched, then the fifth, then the sixth. Silence stretched across the room, thick, fragile, electric. Elijah leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table like the ground had tilted under him. "That can't be right," he whispered, the words slipping out on a shaking breath. His knees buckled just slightly. Naomi caught his arm, steadying him before he sat down too hard. His hands trembled in his lap, the ticket shaking like it had a pulse. They checked the numbers again, then again. Each time Elijah expected it to change, expected reality to snap back to something sensible, but nothing changed. The numbers stayed loyal, every line matched, every digit was right. The truth refused to move. Elijah Turner, a man who'd been dismissed, disrespected, and denied dignity that very morning, had won the largest state lottery in 5 years. The house went quiet, so quiet he could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the wind brushing against the windows, his own heartbeat climbing into his ears. It felt like the world paused, holding its breath as he tried to catch his. Elijah sat slowly in his old armchair, the one that shaped itself to him over decades. The cushions sighed under his weight. He stared at the ticket as if he could make it lie, as if he could make it simpler. He didn't know what a miracle was supposed to feel like, but this didn't feel loud. It didn't feel explosive. It felt still, heavy, like someone opened a door to a room he didn't know he was allowed to enter. Naomi stood beside him, her eyes full of tears she didn't try to hide. She'd always been stronger than she looked, braver than he ever taught her to be. But right now, she was just a daughter watching her father's world break open in front of him. "Daddy," she whispered, "you won, you actually won." But Elijah didn't say anything for a long moment. He just stared at the ticket, his thumb tracing the numbers like he was memorizing them. He thought about mornings that started before the sun, about boots crusted with mud and days spent fighting crops that didn't always fight fair, about winters where the wind cut straight through him and summers where the heat bent him over like an old man before he was one. He thought about harvest nights when he'd return home with his clothes heavy from sweat and his spirit heavier from worry. His entire life had been built on work, on hands, not luck, on faith, not chance, on purpose, not prizes. And now this. Naomi knelt in front of him, her hands resting softly on his knees. Her tears fell freely, but her smile stayed small, tender. "Daddy, this can change everything." Elijah finally lifted his eyes from the ticket. He looked past her, past the wall, past the house, out the window where the fields lay dark and tired. The same fields that held his family's story, the same land that judged no one, doubted no one, dismissed no one. The soil never questioned his worth. "What's money to a man who already got purpose?" he murmured. Naomi swallowed. "Purpose doesn't pay bills. Purpose doesn't fix the tractor. Purpose doesn't stop people from treating you like you're invisible." He didn't disagree, but he didn't answer either. His thoughts drifted back to the bank, the cold floors, the polished counters, the eyes that looked at him like he was trouble walking upright. He remembered Melissa's voice dipping into that tone people used when they thought they were hiding their disgust. He remembered the supervisor sliding his check back across the counter like it might stain his fingers. They saw dirt. Not roots, not history, not a man. Dirt. And now here he was, sitting in the dim light of his living room, holding a ticket worth more than that whole bank branch would see in a year. Life was about to turn a mirror toward that moment, and the reflection would be loud. His fingers tightened around the ticket, not with greed, not with hunger, but with a kind of trembling clarity. Money couldn't make him more of a man. It couldn't give him what he already carried in his bones. But it could protect what mattered. It could shield his daughter from the storms he'd weathered. It could repair the land his father once prayed over. It could turn survival into peace. The weight of that settled deep in his chest. He closed his eyes, breathing in slow through his nose. "Lord," he whispered, voice cracking at the edges, "help me carry this right." Naomi rested her forehead against his knee, her hand wrapping around his. "We will, Daddy," she said softly. "We'll carry it together." Elijah opened his eyes again. The numbers hadn't moved. The world hadn't snapped back. The truth stayed. In that quiet room, with the night pressing gently at the windows, Elijah Turner felt something shift. Not a burst of excitement, not a rush of victory, but a calm, steady rising. A new chapter beginning in silence. A miracle waiting for its moment to speak. The world didn't know yet, but morning was already on its way. Word travels fast in small towns, faster than storms, faster than truth, faster than a man can brace himself for the weight of his own name drifting through other people's mouths. By sunrise, whispers had already broken loose, slipping through coffee shops, gas stations, feed stores, and front porches, carried on breath and gossip and morning frost. The Turner farm hit the jackpot. Elijah won the whole damn thing. Man's richer than the mayor now. Some voices sounded thrilled, lighting up with joy like the news was their own. Others sounded tight sour, like someone had handed them a truth they didn't want, but had to swallow anyway. Money never came quiet. It always stirred something ugly or something warm, sometimes both at once. At the grocery store, where aisles used to feel like tunnels he walked through unnoticed, people suddenly shifted. Faces he barely knew turned toward him with wide smiles. Folks who'd treated him like background noise now stepped into his path. A man who never remembered Elijah's name, called him sir one day, you there the next, suddenly slapped him on the back with too much familiarity. "Hey buddy, big congrats," he shouted across the produce section, loud enough to make oranges tremble in their crates. "Knew you were one of the lucky ones." Elijah gave a small nod, gentle and polite, the same way he nodded at the sunrise every morning. He didn't correct the man, didn't remind him of the years they'd passed each other without a single meaningful word. Elijah didn't hold grudges, but he held memory. That was different. Naomi watched from a few steps away, arms crossed, eyes sharp. She saw how money made people's masks slip, how greed made smiles too wide, how envy made voices too sweet. She watched every handshake, every sudden warmth, every stranger claiming closeness that never existed. But Elijah stayed grounded. He always had. After the store, he went home and moved through his day the way he did every day before the world knew a number had changed his life. He fed the chickens, scattering grain with quiet care. He hammered a loose fence post into place, the rhythm steady and familiar. He hummed hymns his father used to sing at dusk, low, old songs about mercy and storms and walking with burdens you didn't choose. Nothing about him changed, but the world around him was shifting like soil in spring. Late morning, a low rumble crawled down the dirt road, unfamiliar wheels, too smooth to belong to neighbors. Elijah wiped his hands on a cloth and stepped onto the porch just as the news van rolled up, kicking up dust that blurred the lettering on the side until it stopped moving. The doors swung open fast. Reporters jumped out like they were racing a clock, hair sprayed stiff, microphones ready, eyes wide with hunger for the story they wanted him to fit into. Poverty to fortune, struggle to miracle. Black farmer becomes millionaire overnight. They had the headlines already written. They just needed his face to glue to it. They jogged toward him through the dust cloud, shouting his name, questions tumbling like pebbles down a hill. "Mr. Turner, how does it feel? When did you realize? What will you do with? Are you planning to?" Elijah lifted a hand, not to block them, not to hush them, just to create a moment of breath in the chaos. "Ma'am," he said softly to the nearest reporter, his voice steady as warm soil. "I'm still me, ain't no price tag on character." His words weren't fancy, weren't rehearsed, but they hit the reporters like something unexpected, something they didn't know how to package. How do you sensationalize humility? How do you wrap a story in drama when the man at the center refuses to play along? They blinked, lowering their microphones a little. Confusion flickered across their faces, then curiosity, then something almost respectful. Elijah wiped his hands again, like he was brushing off the attention the same way he'd brush off dirt. "You'll want pictures of a man feeding chickens. You help yourselves," he added gently. "Otherwise, I got work to tend to." The reporters stood there, stunned, the dust still settling around their shoes. He walked past them, back toward the barn, humming the same hymn as before. Meanwhile, downtown, the bank buzzed with a different kind of energy, not excitement, not joy. Panic, sharp and whisper-heavy. People gathered in small knots, talking beneath their breaths. The teller counters were slow, conversations faster. Bits and pieces floated through the building like sparks. "Elijah Turner won the lottery. You heard. Millions, not thousands. In 5 years, no jackpot this big." And somewhere behind the counter, Melissa straightened a stack of papers with unnecessary force. She rolled her eyes at the first whisper, dismissing it without thought. Gossip traveled in circles. She didn't have time for stories. But then a customer leaned over the counter to chat with a friend, not even noticing she was listening. "Yeah, it's true name, Elijah Turner." Melissa froze mid-movement. The papers slipped from her fingers, scattering across the desk. "Elijah," she repeated under her breath. Her mind replayed yesterday's scene, her raised eyebrows, her tone dripping with suspicion. The way she'd called the supervisor over like Elijah was a threat instead of a customer. The way she dismissed his check with loud certainty. The humiliation she'd handed him now circled back like a sharp wind. She felt her face drain, her mouth drying as the realization dug into her like a thorn. She had refused a man who now held more money than the bank processed on some weeks. A man whose dignity she'd tried to shrink. A man she looked at like dirt. The room seemed to tilt. She reached for the counter to steady herself, but it didn't steady anything inside her. Reality wasn't just knocking. It was walking right through the front door. And fate, someone whispered nearby, has a sense of humor. Melissa closed her eyes, seeing Elijah's calm face, hearing his quiet words. The weight of her actions wrapped around her throat. And deep down, she knew. Fate wasn't done with her, not even close. The bank smelled the same, cold, sterile, polished tiles gleaming under fluorescent lights, but the air had shifted. Elijah Turner stepped inside, quiet as he always was, carrying no entourage, no cameras, no celebration, just himself. His boots scuffed softly against the floor, carrying the rhythm of decades spent walking fields, not hallways. The room stiffened instantly. Conversations paused mid-word. Chairs scraped against the tile. Eyes darted, Whispers started like they were trying not to be heard, drifting along the walls like dust motes in a shaft of morning light. Melissa's pulse jumped in her throat. She straightened her posture, smoothed her hair, pretended she didn't see him. But guilt lingered, sticking to her skin like humidity after a storm. Every second he stood there reminded her of the check, the loud dismissal, the judgment she'd worn like armor yesterday, armor that now felt absurd. Elijah moved toward her counter with slow certainty, each step deliberate, calm. He placed the same check she had rejected yesterday down in front of her. The paper sat there, unassuming, almost fragile, yet it carried the weight of his labor, his dignity, and the truth she had refused to see. "Morning," he said, his voice even steady, carrying neither anger nor impatience. Melissa's throat worked. She swallowed hard. "Mr. Turner, if I caused you any inconvenience." He raised a hand gently, a gesture that held neither scorn nor distance. It was not to silence her, but to hold the moment in its honesty. "Ma'am," he said softly, "I just came to cash the check that keeps my farm running. Nothing more." Her cheeks burned. Heat rose in sudden, sharp waves. The supervisor, sensing the tension, appeared at her side, words tumbling too quickly, too eager. "Yes, Mr. Turner, right away. Our sincerest apologies for doing your job differently depending on who stands in front of you." Elijah's words were quiet, soft, deliberate, but they cut through the air like a slow-melting candle, illuminating what everyone had known but refused to name. The supervisor stuttered, grasping for footing, while Melissa's eyes fell to the counter. The room shifted. Customers glanced at one another, uncomfortable with the mirror being held up in front of them. No one moved, no one spoke. They didn't need to. Elijah didn't raise his voice. He didn't slam his fists. He didn't parade his recent fortune, or the lottery win, or the vindication of being right. He simply held space for fairness, the kind he had spent his entire life trying to claim, piece by piece. Melissa's fingers trembled slightly as she processed the moment. She saw the man she had doubted, the life she had underestimated, sitting there with the same quiet strength he always carried. There was no spectacle, no dramatics, only truth laid bare on the counter in ink and paper and calm eyes. The transaction unfolded without incident. The cash exchanged hands. Elijah counted it slowly, methodically, nodding politely as he stacked it in his wallet. Each movement measured, controlled, intentional. He looked up once at Melissa, his expression neutral, almost gentle, and then he turned toward the door. The silence he left behind was thicker than words. It pressed into the room like sunlight through blinds, revealing everything that had been hidden: doubt, prejudice, fear, guilt. Everyone present felt it, some shifting uneasily in their seats, some staring at the floor. No one dared speak first. He didn't glance back. He didn't need to. The lesson had been delivered in the simplest way possible, by presence, by calm, by the refusal to give anger its stage. Some lessons carry more weight in their quiet moments than any shout could ever muster. The customers returned slowly to their routines, their conversations quieter, more thoughtful. Melissa remained at her post, hands folded, eyes downcast. The supervisor lingered near the counter, awkward and unsure. The check, now empty of dispute, still seemed to hum in the air, a quiet testimony to the man who had stood for himself without raising a fist. Elijah stepped out into the sunlight, letting the door close softly behind him. The wind carried the dust of the parking lot across his boots, brushing against the hem of his jeans, brushing against the remnants of humiliation he refused to let cling to him. He walked to his truck, slow, steady, with the same careful rhythm he used on the farm. Hands calloused from soil, work, and decades of quiet struggle rested on the wheel. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He just breathed, a deep, even breath, feeling the weight of the world slightly lighter because justice, in its simplest form, had been served. Some moments teach without raising a fist. Some victories don't need applause. And this was one of them. An hour later, the bank doors swung open again, and the quiet morning was gone. Cameras stormed in like a second winter, bright lights and microphones shoving through the air, turning polished tile into a stage. Local news crews, journalists, bloggers, all clawing for a frame, a quote, a reaction. They weren't chasing scandal. They were chasing closure. The story had grown beyond whispers. Elijah Turner, humble farmer, denied dignity at the counter, suddenly a millionaire overnight. The state had caught wind. The world wanted to see what they had missed. Melissa froze, rooted behind her counter. Microphones jutted toward her like accusing fingers, their cables tangling around her feet, their lenses magnifying every hesitation. Elijah Turner said you refused his check. Is that true? Did you think the check was fraudulent because of racial profiling? Do you regret how you treated him? Her lips quivered, her eyes darted to the door, the ceiling, anywhere that might promise escape. There was none. The bank manager stepped forward, a man of suit and nervous authority, gesturing frantically toward the lobby. Please, outside, step outside, he urged, but the cameras had already captured every corner, every twitch. The stream had begun. The world was watching. In the middle of the chaos, Elijah stepped through the doors again. He didn't come for drama, didn't come for vengeance. Naomi's hand on his elbow had pressed him forward, a gentle insistence that the truth needed telling. Cameras pivoted instantly, lights snapping toward him. The questions shouted over one another, echoing in the polished lobby. He raised a hand, the motion cutting through the noise like a soft bell in a crowded room. You'll listen, he said, voice calm, firm, carrying the weight of someone who had lived long enough to know what mattered. I didn't come to shame nobody. The cameras paused, microphones dipped, even the whispers in the corners seemed to hold their breath. I came to remind folks, he continued, slow, deliberate, that respect ain't something you hand out based on clothes or color. It's supposed to be given 'cause we all human. The words hung in the air, quiet but sharp, heavier than any accusation, steadier than any confrontation. The kind of truth that settles, that shifts a room without a yell, without spectacle, without the flash of money. Melissa's hands shook slightly, her mouth opening, closing, unsure what to say. Her eyes welled not because she sought forgiveness, but because for the first time she truly saw. She saw the weight of her actions, the dignity she'd dismissed, the life she'd underestimated. She felt it press against her chest like the cold marble beneath her fingertips. Elijah didn't step closer. He didn't need to. The truth had done the work. He simply let it sit, steady and firm, as he nodded once toward the cameras, toward the crowd, toward the room that had held him back yesterday. Naomi stood behind him, quiet, watching her father carry the moment with the same grace he carried his land, his family, his life. The bank manager's lips moved, forming words that might have been apology, direction, or surrender. They were lost in the stillness Elijah created. Outside, viewers watched live as history unfolded in small gestures. Inside, silence bloomed where chaos had been. Sometimes truth arrives softly. Sometimes it arrives with cameras and microphones, a spotlight catching what polite society wanted hidden. But tonight, it didn't shout. It didn't hum with gossip or scandal. It settled in the space between breaths, in the pause after Elijah spoke, in the quiet shame of recognition. Melissa looked down, nodded once, and inhaled slowly, the room exhaling with her. She understood something she hadn't yesterday, that the measure of a man isn't counted in dollars or checks or appearances. It's counted in the weight of his words, the steadiness of his hands, the quiet dignity he carries in spite of the world. And sometimes, the world has no choice but to see. Elijah sank into the worn wooden chair on the porch, letting the evening air settle around him. His hands rested on his knees, calloused from decades of plowing, planting, and harvesting, hands that knew labor and patience better than luxury or wealth. The field stretched before him, dark now under the low sun, silent except for the occasional rustle of a dying wind through bare stalks. The farm had always been honest. It had never lied about effort or failure or reward. Naomi slipped onto the bench beside him, her head leaning against his shoulder like she had when she was little, when storms were loud and the nights long. He felt the softness of her hair, the steady rhythm of her breathing, and the familiar weight of responsibility carried now by both of them. You think today changed anything? She asked, voice small but steady, searching his face for the answer he hadn't yet given to the world. Elijah smiled, but it wasn't a happy smile. It was quiet, reflective, the kind of smile that comes from knowing life moves slower than headlines. Change starts slow, baby, he said. Like seeds, folks see the plant long before they see the roots growing. The truth of it lay in the earth beneath them, in the unseen labor that fed the visible growth. He hadn't planned to move. He didn't dream of flashy cars or mansions that scraped the sky. That kind of wealth was not his measure of success. His measure was steadier, older, rooted deeper. His plan was simple, and it had nothing to do with himself. Fix the farm, restore what had been damaged over the years, clear debts for families he knew personally, people who had labored quietly, who had been underestimated, overlooked, and counted out by the world. Fund scholarships for kids like Naomi, bright, brilliant, and sometimes unseen until someone cared enough to notice. Money, he believed, wasn't power. Character was, work ethic, integrity, the ability to stand when the world tried to push you down. That was real strength. That was inheritance. That was wealth worth carrying. Even with millions in the bank, he still felt like the man who woke at sunrise, who fed the animals, who whispered prayers into the wind, who listened to the rhythm of the land and learned its secrets. Nothing about the numbers changed that. Nothing could. Later that night, after the stars had spread thin across the sky and the wind had softened into quiet whispers, an email arrived from Melissa. He opened it with no expectation of drama, only curiosity. It was long, apologetic, vulnerable. She admitted bias, assumptions, her shame. She wrote not to seek forgiveness, but to confess what she had seen too late, to acknowledge the weight she had carried invisibly until now. Elijah read her words twice, feeling the slow unravel of guilt and recognition from the other side of the counter, from the world he had already walked past. He didn't type a response, didn't click send. He closed the laptop gently, resting his hands on it for a moment as if to press the lesson into memory. He whispered into the quiet room, people learn, sometimes the hard way. Naomi, sleeping now on the couch, breathed softly, unaware of the subtle shift that had passed over the family, over the farm, over the weight of justice that had landed without fanfare or spectacle. Some lessons, Elijah knew, take time to breathe. They unfold slowly, like seeds pushing through soil towards sunlight, unseen until the day they rise tall and undeniable. He leaned back in the chair, eyes toward the horizon. The farm waited, the world waited, and he, steady as ever, waited too, patient as the soil, faithful as the seasons, strong as the roots only he could see. Winter's chills softened under the slow crawl of sunrise, painting Elijah Turner's fields in gold that touched every frost-laced blade. He stood at the edge of the land, hands tucked into worn pockets, shoulders squared against the crisp morning air. Tractors hummed in the distance, steady and rhythmic, like a heartbeat, as workers moved through the field, laughing and shouting, repairing the old barn he refused to tear down, the one his father built, the one he had inherited, the one that still smelled faintly of hay and old wood. Naomi walked up to him, carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee, her steps careful across the uneven soil. She held one out to him silently, eyes wide, voice lowered to a reverent whisper. "You did all this," she said. Elijah shook his head, letting the steam curl into the air. "No," he replied softly. "We did. Community grows like crops together. You plant, you nurture, you water. You don't take credit alone." The month since the lottery win had moved slowly but decisively. News of his generosity spread quietly at first, then more loudly handwritten letters arriving at the farm, small parcels of thanks, strangers mailing notes of gratitude and recognition. Even Melissa eventually came. She stepped nervously onto the soil, boots scuffing against the ground she had once dismissed him from, eyes lowered, lips trembling. Elijah met her gaze calmly, welcoming her without hesitation. She knelt slightly, hands folded, words spilling with apology, tears streaking her cheeks. She admitted her ignorance, her assumptions, her mistake, her human failing made visible. He didn't lecture her, didn't punish, didn't allow himself a moment of triumph. He simply nodded, the weight of his experience folded into the motion, and said quietly, "Make sure the next person you greet at that counter feels seen." She promised she would. The words were small but carried weight, a seed planted, slow and unseen, but destined to grow. As Melissa left, Naomi tilted her head, her curiosity softening the morning light. Why forgive her? Elijah smiled, slow and deliberate, a smile that creased the corners of eyes hardened by years of labor and long nights. Forgiveness ain't for her, he said. It's for the soil in my own heart. If you carry grudges, they root deep and choke everything else. The wind swept through the wheat, whispering over the fields like an old voice, soft and constant. It rustled each stalk, carrying the scent of winter and earth, carrying truths older than memory, truths he had learned from generations who had walked these same rows before him. He turned, surveying the acres that had witnessed struggle, sweat, and sorrow. The barn, now patched and sturdy, stood as testament to patience. The tractors worked in harmony with the land. His workers moved as a single rhythm, not for glory, but because there was work to do and life demanded care. Money hadn't changed him. It had not inflated his pride, nor sharpened his ego. It had only cleared the path for attention, attention he had long deserved, but the world had refused to give. And now, with the sun stretching across the horizon like an outstretched hand, he breathed in the cold morning air, letting the warmth of light touch his face, letting the years of labor, patience, and quiet dignity settle into him. Respect is the real harvest, he whispered, his voice low but steady, carrying across the fields. Everything else is just weather. The wheat bent and swayed as if in agreement, the land itself bearing witness to the truth he had carried all his life. Quiet, patient, resilient. And in that light, Elijah Turner stood not as a millionaire, not as a man who had won the lottery, but as a keeper of dignity, a cultivator of fairness, a witness to the power of steady, enduring humanity.